So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today. My name is Evan Reis, and as Ali said, I'm Executive Director of the U.S. Resiliency Council. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to sort of promoting the goals of more resilient construction nationwide for earthquakes and other natural hazards like hurricanes and floods and now wildfires. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about why we believe resilience is important, but I'm going to also focus a bit on what members of the community right now, both the private and the public sector, are doing to implement resilience in their building stock and thereby make our communities more resilient. So there's a misconception out there that sustainability is all about green design, right? That it's all about us having a lower impact on the environment, not using as much energy or water or polluting the air. All of those things are obviously very important. But there's another side to sustainability too, and that is that the environment have a low impact on us. And we see after every major natural disaster just how important that is to the recovery of cities and communities and businesses and even families. This is Superstorm Sandy. This Superstorm Sandy hit in, of course, the East Coast near New York and New Jersey. This area had more LEED certified green buildings than anywhere else in the world. But it also caused 380,000 buildings to be damaged or destroyed, billions of dollars of loss, and at the very bottom you can see there that over 10 million cubic yards of debris were generated in Superstorm Sandy. All that debris had to be trucked off-site, expending a lot of energy. It all is degrading in landfills right now, leaching chemicals into the air and water, and of course it has to be replaced by 10 million cubic yards of new material. So when we really talk about a fully sustainable community, we have to talk about one, too, that can weather the impacts of natural disasters so that this kind of thing doesn't happen. And that's sort of what the U.S. Resiliency Council's kind of mission is. We recognize, and Ms. Rosen spoke about this very well, about how there are so many aspects of our community that are essential to making us more resilient. You see all the sort of services and functions that a community might have. And central to all of those, of course, is the performance of our buildings, right? We don't do anything other than hang out on the beach outside of a building, typically. We go to school, we live, we eat, we work, we shop. We conduct business inside a building. So while buildings themselves are not the most important measure of a community's resilience, it's the people, obviously, and the functions of a city. They are central to what allows a community to recover more quickly. So the U.S. Resiliency Council's mission, we call our mission to improve community resilience one building at a time. And the goal is to make the case for better performing, higher performing structures so that the rest of the community can recover quickly after an event. Another misconception that a lot of people have is about what the building code gives you when it comes to building performance in natural disasters. You talk to most people and they think all of the new buildings that are built are earthquake proof, because why would anybody build a building that wasn't earthquake proof? A best example of that kind of comes from the New Zealand earthquakes that we had back in 2010, 2011. These were what New Zealand would consider the big one. You've all probably heard different scenarios that could happen in Southern California, sort of the big event that causes hundreds of billions of dollars, as Ali said, and causes hundreds of thousands of quake refugees. Well, this was their equivalent, these two earthquakes in 2010 and 11. The good news is that of the thousands of buildings in the downtown area, only 2 collapsed, and most of the deaths that occurred, I think there were 156 deaths, occurred in those buildings, most of them. And so from the perspective of meeting the code's goal is to protect lives in a large event. It was a success. But more than half of the downtown building district was eventually demolished. Okay, so people lost their homes, their businesses, they lost their jobs. their investments, and even today it's not fully recovered. And so if you talk to structural engineers, they say, well, this was kind of a success story because New Zealand had its biggest earthquake and only 2 buildings collapsed. But of course, if you talk to almost anybody who lived or worked in Christchurch, they'd say it was a total disaster. So that's another goal of the USRC, is to try and fix these misconceptions and bring sort of the public and the engineering understandings closer together. It's not that we can't get to what the public is expecting, but we have to make sure that we understand where the gap is now and how to achieve that level of performance. So this is a beautiful little graphic of Los Angeles. And just to put things in perspective, the slide I previously showed talked about Christchurch, the downtown business district, which is a relatively new-ish kind of area, and that only 2 buildings built to modern codes had collapsed. In Los Angeles, this color-coded map shows the ages of buildings in LA. And it's only the ones at the very end, the ones in orange, that are built to modern codes. Okay? Everything else was built before what structural engineers would consider modern earthquake codes. So if modern earthquake codes, the ones built from 2000 on, or the late 1990s on, are the ones that we expect to be safe, but still could suffer a lot of damage, a la Christchurch, what about the 90+% of buildings that were built before modern codes? Now, this picture isn't any different in San Francisco or Portland or most other major cities, but it is a challenge to understand what our risk is. And Ali kind of said what I was going to say. I was in Spokane last year, and I spoke to this crowd of about 600 or 700 legislators and public officials from all around the Pacific Northwest. And I was talking about the difference between good leadership or ordinary leadership and great leadership. And I used as my example of great leadership the city of Santa Monica, okay? Comparing that to, say, the cities of Houston, Texas, and New Orleans, and some other cities that have been hit by disasters. Santa Monica, as Ali said, more than any other city in the country, has taken a proactive initiative to identify the vulnerable buildings in its city and set forth ordinances to retrofit those buildings over time, okay, to make them safer for the occupants. So that is an example of challenging but great leadership on the part of a city, the city council, plus the city business leaders, to agree that their city is worth preserving, and of course the people and the residents are worth preserving. But I'm going to talk a little bit beyond these kinds of ordinances, these sort of retrofit ordinances to take older buildings and bring them up to a measure of life safety. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it takes to get to even more resilience, because a building that is life safe but has to be demolished after an event like the many in Christchurch, while it obviously does its main goal of protecting lives, it doesn't contribute much to the resiliency of the community and being able to get back in operation, right, and provide that service. The building still has to be replaced. So the U.S. Resiliency Council has at its heart a rating system. Very simple. You know, we have rating systems for everything, for our cars, for our restaurants, for the colleges our kids go to. And this rating system focuses on 3 dimensions: safety, damage, which is like the repair cost, and recovery time, how long it takes to get back into business or back to doing what that building did. And what we want to start with is recognizing that our modern codes, even the buildings built today, focus on safety. Their goal is to focus on making sure that people can get out of the building alive, not be heavily injured, but not necessarily on the building itself being repairable. And so to move to the next step is resilience-based design, where we know that the buildings will suffer a limited amount of damage so that they can be repaired, so it's economical to repair them, and be able to be recoverable within days, weeks, or even a few months depending on the building. Whereas today, a building built to the minimum standards of the code in a large earthquake, if the Ridgecrest earthquake were here, might not be recoverable at all. And the good news is, and I'm going to show some case studies now, is that that cost to get from that minimum code level design to a more resilient design typically only costs on average between about 1% to 2% more to build the building. Okay, and when you figure if you had an $80,000 Corvette and you drove it into a wall at 20 miles an hour, you'd be able to walk away from that crash because of all the safety features. But your Corvette would be a total loss. But if you could spend an extra 1%, an extra $800, and get a Corvette that still looked like a Corvette and drove like a Corvette, but if you drove it into a wall, not only would you walk away, but the car would be in the shop for a couple days and then be as good as new. Wouldn't you do that? So if you're going to do that for an $80,000 car, why wouldn't you do that for an $80 million building, right? So that's, again, part of what the USRC is trying to show. Now, we can take a lesson from one of our Pacific neighbors in Japan. Okay, in Japan, they have more earthquakes than we do here, although the severity of the earthquakes isn't necessarily any greater than what we might expect here. And so their country being much smaller geographically, everybody knows somebody that's been in an earthquake, or everybody's been in an earthquake. And so they have a much different philosophy around the value of earthquake protection in the marketplace. Buildings that have high earthquake resistance can rent for up to 40% more than buildings that don't, or sell for more than 40% more. And to show you an example of what I mean, I looked for two different ads for luxury apartments, one in San Francisco and one in Tokyo. And the one I found in San Francisco online, it was like every other one. It was on the roof of some condo. There were couches and a fireplace and chairs and looking over the city. It was beautiful. That's what I want to spend my millions of dollars on. Well, there's a picture down there in a Tokyo subway that a friend of mine took. That is a picture, an advertisement for a luxury condo in Tokyo. That's the basement, and those are the base isolators that you see in that building. Okay, that's what sells a multi-million-dollar condo in Tokyo. We don't have that here yet, but we want to get to that point. We want to get to that point where a developer or an owner will say, it's worth me adding another 1% to the cost of my building if I can get higher rents because people recognize the value of this. So I've got a few examples to show you, and I picked these examples because they represent sort of different parts of what makes a community resilient. The first building to receive a USRC rating was a platinum rating, which was sort of 5 stars across the board. The top rating in safety, damage, and recovery was a Civic building. This was up in Roseville, which is outside Sacramento. It's a Civic building that's part city offices and part community college leased space. And the city decided they wanted a higher level of performance of this building because the functions that go on in that building were important to making the city run after an earthquake. The rental space that they leased to the community college brought in revenue to the city. So they were able to achieve higher community resilience because they put in place a building that was thus rated. And this didn't cost any more or take any longer than a building that would have been built straight to code. This was all done within the confines of the budget that the owner essentially gave to the contractor and the developer to do this. This example is the one I'm very proud of. This is a building we just issued a rating on literally like 2 weeks ago. This is a 9-story affordable housing building in San Francisco that is nearly complete now. It's just, they're doing finishes. And, affordable housing is probably one of the biggest challenges we face in this state. Everybody knows that. There isn't a place in the state that isn't affected by it. This building will serve low-income seniors, 20% of whom were at one point homeless. And this building, because it has a really interesting little seismic damper in the basement, in the foundation actually, underneath the shear walls, received a USRC Gold rating. A USRC Gold rating means that the building damage is expected to be less than 10% of the replacement cost. And it should be reoccupiable within weeks after the event, as opposed to months or years or longer. And when you're talking about vulnerable populations, these are the ones that are not only have the hardest time finding housing now, but after an earthquake will be the very last ones to be able to relocate and find housing after an event. So this exactly goes to Ali's comment about the LA Times article and the quake refugees, right? Well, these folks won't be quake refugees. They'll need shelter maybe for a couple of weeks, and then they can get back in the building and live. And so this is the example of a city that supported the developer putting this public housing in their city that would make their vulnerable populations more resilient. This is a 22-story luxury condo, not in California. This is in Chile. And it was recently completed. It was base isolated, so those little things that I showed you from the subway in Tokyo, they're in this building. And it received a USRC Platinum rating. And the reason this building is base isolated is because the owner of the building in Chile know that they could get a higher market value for selling these condominiums, because they too have a lot of earthquakes. In fact, one of the largest earthquakes in the world occurred off the coast of Chile. And so this building, these apartments, these condos will sell for more now because they are able to advertise that this building not only is safe, but the investment itself will be protected. There should be no loss of occupancy whatsoever in this building after a major earthquake. And it's not just about market value for selling properties. Here's a building in San Francisco. Okay, this is another building in San Francisco. It's a steel frame building. It's very interesting. So this is the building here. You can see there's a building on the left side and a building over there on the right side. And the owner wanted to build this thing, and it's 5 stories tall, and so it moves around a bit. It would move around a bit. And so by code, the engineer had to put a gap between these two buildings, right? And so they had this gap that was about this big. But then the engineer said, if we stiffen this building up, if we make it much stiffer so it doesn't move around as much, we can make the gap this big, because it's not going to bang into the buildings. And as it turns out, that extra space was several thousand square feet of rentable space. And so the extra revenue that the developer achieved by being able to squeeze it in a little tighter to these new buildings allowed him to pay for the system, the structural system that made the building stiffer in the first place. So they get back that cost. They have a more resilient building, a building that's going to suffer minimal damage, because they were able to, if you will, increase the rental space. Now, we also hope eventually that'll be able to increase the rental value, that these owners will be able to tell their tenants, look, you're in a building where after an earthquake, your employees will be able to get back into it in a matter of weeks and you can start conducting business again. Okay? And then, just a couple weeks ago, I was up in Portland, Oregon. So Portland, Oregon has struggled mightily with retrofit ordinances. Okay, they were nowhere near as far along as cities in California, certainly not as far along as Santa Monica. But they do have, sort of standards that if you do a major renovation of a building, you have to bring it up to code. And there are several owners there that have wanted to do voluntary seismic upgrades. And in particular, 4 of their sort of historic unreinforced masonry buildings, all over 100 years old, over the past 5 or 6 years were heavily seismically retrofitted. Not because of a city ordinance, but because the owner was doing major renovations and they felt that they were going to invest all of this money in renovating these buildings, they might as well, make them stronger seismically as well. And the neat thing about this is one building is another low-income affordable housing complex. We have a headquarters of a non-profit organization, a boutique hotel, and a standard mixed-use retail. So you have 4 different owners of 4 completely different building types that all made the same decision that it was in their own financial interest, in addition, of course, to protecting the occupants of the building, to strengthen these buildings and improve their performance. So we went up there a couple weeks ago, made a big deal of it. We presented them with the USRC rating because their buildings were improved to essentially comply with modern codes. And we believe that each of the 4 of these, should they choose, will eventually be able to get a discount on their insurance costs. Because no longer will an insurance company have to treat these buildings as 100-year-old masonry buildings, which have a high rate, but they can treat them essentially as modern code-complying buildings because that's how they were retrofitted. So again, there are benefits. In fact, the hotel up in the upper right was able to take advantage of a tax credit because it's a nationally historic structure, and that tax credit paid for the retrofit itself. So again, there are ways to lessen the burden on owners and developers if we're smart about recognizing the value of what these provide. And then finally, the final example is a building that's going up now. It's in Sacramento. It's actually in review right now, but we expect it to receive a USRC Platinum rating. This is a state office building. And within the RFP for the state office building, it said you will get extra points on the proposal if you design this to be more resilient. So the developer and the contractor took the lead and said, okay, we're going to design this to achieve a USRC Platinum rating. So now builders themselves and developers are starting to win more projects because they are adding resilience. If you go on a website of any kind of major property management company or developer, like say Saris Regis, you will see that they advertise LEED certified buildings for apartments they're selling because that adds value. Now we can see that even adding resilience is another way for builders to distinguish themselves and add value to what they bring. So finally, what we want to do as part of the USRC, we have leaders like Santa Monica that are developing ordinances requiring the retrofit of vulnerable buildings. We want to expand that to look at incentives that cities and insurers and lenders and other stakeholders can offer to make it more attractive to voluntarily upgrade buildings. Cities, for instance, could offer expedited permitting for owners that come in with a higher USRC rating or a high resilience rating. Because, of course, that better rating means the city will recover more quickly after an event. So it's in the city's benefit to offer something like, well, let's get this building online quicker then. And an expedited permit, if you're a developer, you know how important that is. Same thing with counties. You know, they're the ones that monitor the property taxes. After an earthquake, if the building is destroyed, the property tax base of that building goes away. So if an owner wants to come in and say, I want to retrofit my building or design a building to a higher standard, maybe there could be some county property tax relief for that. The state and federal government have to expend fewer funds. The Office of Emergency Services knows this. They expend fewer funds on buildings that are less damaged, less public assistance is needed, so that there should be grants available to owners to make their buildings more resilient. And then lenders and insurers also benefit from more resilient buildings. Lenders pose or face less of a risk that a borrower will default on a loan if the building is going to suffer less damage. And the lender certainly doesn't want to be left with a damaged building and have to figure out how to repair it. So we're working with Fannie Mae right now to offer some lending discounts on properties that are designed to higher levels. And same thing with insurance companies. The fewer claims they have, the more policies they can issue, the better rates that they can give. So the USRC, in addition to working on policy for mandated work and performance standards, we're working very heavily with building stakeholders to try and get them interested in offering incentives to make it easier to retrofit and design better buildings. So that's all I had. I thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you today. We'll have time for questions afterwards.